This video is going to be about installing Windows 98 on the ITX-Llama on a SATA solid-state drive. SSDs are recommended for Windows 98 because they do offer better disk performance than an SD card. One thing to note is that you may have issues with DOS detecting the amount of space on your SSD. I don't know if this was a specific issue with my SSD, which is a PNY 500GB drive, but DOS 7.1 could only detect 18GB, so I couldn't properly partition it in DOS. Large SD cards were no problem, and I was able to easily partition and use up all the space on a 256GB SD card. However, my SSD was a problem. To get the SSD drive working, I had to go into Windows and partition it there. I had to partition it into multiple 32GB partitions as Windows wouldn't let me format a disk with FAT32 that's over 32GB. I tried both the disk management utility, the command prompt format command, and also the diskpart command line program. None allowed me to format the SSDs with FAT32 partitions that are over 32GB. People on the ITX-Llama Discord were very helpful and gave me ideas on being able to do this. Suggestions mentioned were using the FAT32 format program by Ridgecrop Consultants or using a live CD with a Gparted. At the moment, I'm just going to stick with the 32GB limit because I'm just doing tests right now and that's plenty of space for Windows 98. Let me tell you some issues I had. I've had several errors telling me that Windows could not be installed, including some Windows upgrade errors, and of course my partition issues I mentioned earlier. But let me tell you how I got the installation to work. In Windows, I created only one 32GB FAT32 partition on the SSD. I'll try using bigger partitions in the future. I also did not have my SD card inserted. I think I was getting the Windows upgrade errors because I had a Windows 3.1 installation on the SD card. On top of that, if I had the Windows 98 setup files on the SD card and run it from there, Windows would try to install on the SD card instead of the SSD. You also want to prepare the Windows setup files and the drivers for Windows 98 so they can be copied later onto the SSD or a micro SD card. I recommend using Ivan Bowler's custom Windows 98 setup because there are some drivers integrated into that setup that will make the Windows installation smoother. You can obtain that setup from Ivan's GitHub. Okay, so now I'm going to configure the partition I have on the SSD. With the SSD installed on the Llama, I boot up the computer. I went into fdisk and made sure that the main partition was active. Ignore the second partition, I eventually deleted it later, in case that was causing me issues in the Windows 98 setup. After setting the partition active, I had to restart the computer. When the computer finished booting up, I ran a new fdisk command. This one is fdisk /mbr. I'm not sure if it's required here, but it has to be done with an SD card, so I did it here. Then I formatted the SSD again and told the format to copy the system files. That's what the /S switch does. All this will make the SSD bootable. When the formatting is done, I'll give the partition a label. I'm just going to call it Win98. I'm now going to remove the SSD from my ITX-Llama. I'm doing this because I want to copy the Windows 98 setup files onto the SSD. I tried having the Windows 98 setup files on a SD card to install onto the SSD, but for some reason that wouldn't work for me. So I'm copying the files instead to the SATA SSD. In addition to the Windows 98 setup, I also copied the necessary drivers onto the SSD. The necessary drivers for the Llama are available on Ivan Bowler's GitHub. However, for the video card, you will need to find the specific driver for your card. So with the hard drive plugged in back into the Llama, I booted up the computer. I went into the BIOS by hitting F1 on this message and made sure that the boot order was the SATA drive first and then the SD card. I really didn't care what booted after those devices. I saved the BIOS and let the system boot again. and it booted into the SSD. In DOS, I navigated to where I copied the Windows setup files and ran the setup. Everything was going smoothly in the setup, except when I reached this section, I did get this run DLL32 error, but closing it and continuing showed no further issues. After the installation was complete and the computer booted into Windows 98, Windows 98 successfully detected my monitor. Now it's time to install more drivers. When Windows first booted up, the startup sound did not sound correct. Listen to this. Let's hope an audio driver update will fix this. But this intro sequence did sound correct. Now it's time to install the drivers. I installed the audio driver first. There's a setup program for this audio driver, so I'll run that. When the setup program is done, I'm asked to restart the computer. I'll go ahead and do that. When the Windows started up again, more sound hardware was detected, and I was asked for the location of the drivers. I accidentally skipped the first prompt, but the next couple of prompts I properly chose the location of the driver. It's the same location where I copied the driver I got from GitHub. When Windows finished completely booting up, I was getting no sound, and there is also no speaker icon in the system tray. Before I fix this audio issue, let me first install the USB drivers. USB drivers are done. I'll restart. And now to fix the audio issue. To fix this, I went into the device manager. This is probably because when the computer booted up and prompted me for a driver location at the beginning, I skipped the first one accidentally. So let me go into the device manager. And here I see an ITX-Llama entry for the sound driver. I'll select reinstall driver here and select the folder where I have the driver located. You can now see the speaker icon in the system tray. And sound works. I'll now restart the computer to test the startup sound. And it also works. And the audio isn't stuttering like it was before the driver was installed. Now I'll go to the device manager again and I'll fix this USB driver error. And from the device manager, I'll also install the Ethernet driver. After the Ethernet driver is done, I have to restart again. Finally, I'm going to install the driver for my 3DFX Voodoo card. The driver is done, and after restarting, the desktop colors look much better. Strangely, I could not get the driver to work at my monitor's native resolution of 1600 by 1200. Not sure what the issue is, but I'll just stick to the 800 by 600 resolution for now, because that should evenly scale to my monitor's native resolution. So that's it for now. I will hopefully have some game tests for you in the future, so watch out for those. Thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you next time.